Good afternoon, everybody. Good evening for those of you in Norway. I'm Clifford Channon, and on behalf of the 9/11 Memorial and Museum, I'd like to welcome you to the resumption for the winter-spring season of our public programs calendar. We are still in virtual mode, but that has not stopped us from finding our way to a remarkable number of people over the course of the season who will take us in part during the season into what we're hoping to almost review as the history of al-Qaeda, where we began the story that culminated on 9/11, the 20th anniversary of 9/11, now in this calendar year. And our programming here at the museum will be very heavily oriented around exploring different aspects of what 20 years since 9/11 means. Of course, the story of 9/11 begins well before 9/11. And it's hard to imagine coming to a conversation with anyone who is better versed in those early years of what would become al-Qaeda, even before there was an al-Qaeda, than our guest today. Dr. Thomas Hegghammer, who has actually been with us before, is a senior research fellow at the Norwegian Defence Research Establishment in Oslo, Norway. He was trained in Middle East Studies at Oxford, Sciences Po in Paris. He's held fellowships at Harvard, Princeton, NYU, and Stanford, as well as the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton. He's published widely. He's testified before the US Congress and the British Parliament. He has written op-eds for the Times and the Wall Street Journal. But we're here today to talk about his new book, which is called The Caravan. I'm going to hold it up for you. The Caravan, Abdallah Azzam and the Rise of Global Jihad, which is from Cambridge University Press. And so it really goes back to some of the origins of where we are today and how this movement of global jihad emerged. So Thomas, welcome, and thank you again for taking the time to be with us.
Thank you for having me. It's really a great pleasure, Cliff. Thank you.
A couple of housekeeping notes. If you're in interest of having or in need of having live captioning, you can click on the link at the bottom of your screen. If you have questions for Thomas during the course of the program, submit the questions by using the chat bubble. So, Thomas, let's start. The cover of your book talks about the rise of global jihad. And the first sentence of your book is about why it explains that the book is about why jihad went global. So let's start there. What were the factors that contributed to the emergence of this transnational, international movement that would reach into terrorism as a tactic, as we saw on 9/11? And tell us about the origins of this. And if you would also, tell us about what the common perception of jihad was before the emergence of this global movement.
Sure. Yeah. So this question of why jihadism went global has been a big research question in the academic community, because militant Islamists, in the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, they were not going around the world setting off bombs in Western capitals and elsewhere. They were mostly fighting locally and typically against their respective regimes. We can think of the assassination of the Egyptian president Anwar Sadat in 1981 as a good example of that type of militancy, and which was the norm for a very long time. But then, from the sort of late 80s onward, you see more and more militant Islamists kind of moving around as what we tend to call foreign fighters, to join conflicts in other Muslim countries, and later on some of them start conducting attacks in faraway places, in the West and elsewhere. So you have this globalization emerging, and of course, it sort of culminates, at least in terms of impact, on 9/11, but in some sense, the globalization of the movement as such only continued, and help with the internet and so on. It became truly a sort of worldwide phenomenon. But the reality is that that this sort of going global happened at a particular point in time, and so the question is, why did it happen in the late 80s, 90s, and not before?
Let me just come in, because the actors that are key here, we know Osama bin Laden, but Abdallah Azzam, who is the subject of the book is a biography of him intertwined with the history of the emergence of global jihad. Place those two actors, if you would, into the narrative of the emergence of global jihad. How did they come to this? What was their relationship with one another? And what did they do to feed this phenomenon?
Yeah, so I guess everyone knows bin Laden and his history. It is in broad terms, perhaps less so Abdallah Azzam. So Abdallah Azzam was it's sometimes referred to as the mentor of Osama bin Laden. He was older. He was a Palestinian preacher who was about nearly 20 years older than bin Laden, and who was a senior figure who influenced bin Laden a lot. And they were together in Afghanistan in the 1980s during the war against the Soviets there. And the two of them sort of represent different stages, two different stages in the globalization of jihad. We can think of it as sort of a rocket with sort of 2 or 3 elements, and Azzam is sort of the first element, and he's the one who first starts to talk about the need for Muslims to fight on each other's behalf, and this is where the idea of foreign fighting comes from. This is why so many volunteer fighters from the Middle East traveled all the way to Afghanistan to fight. It was largely because of Azzam's ideas about the need to sort of stand together and travel if need be to defend sort of the Muslim nation. So he helped internationalize these networks and and sort of cement this idea that all Muslims are one people, and if some of them are in trouble or in conflict somewhere, then other Muslims, wherever they are, have to travel there and fight, because these national borders don't really matter. However, his kind of the type of fighting that he wanted was basically sort of local guerrilla warfare in these conflicts, like Afghanistan. And so he would also have approved of things like the war in Bosnia, where people traveled there as foreign fighters, or Chechnya and so on. But he would probably not have approved, at least not while he was alive. He died in 1989. Had he lived later on, it's far from clear that he would have approved of the 9/11 attacks, because it was a very different type of tactic. It was not about fighting Russian soldiers in uniform in the battlefield of Afghanistan. It was attacking in a city, in a country, in an area at peace. So and this is where bin Laden comes in. So he represents sort of the next stage, and he takes the sort of worldview that Azzam has been kind of creating of a Muslim world under attack, in crisis, under siege, under sort of an existential threat on multiple sides from non-Muslims who want to kill and humiliate Muslims. And the idea that Muslims have to stand together and fight for each other against this outside assault. But he proposes a different strategy, a different way of fighting. So he comes up with the idea of taking the war kind of to the enemy, to the enemy's home, as it were, start attacking America in particular, because he sees the U.S. as sort of the root source of, or the kind of the leader of this wide assault on the Muslim nation. And so for this to stop, he thinks they have to attack, America, attacking the heart of America. But it's still within a logic of kind of self-defense, the logic that it was the non-Muslims, the Jews and the Crusaders, as they call them, who started it and who are kind of threatening the Muslims, and we're only fighting back, he would say, but we need to do it with unconventional means because we don't have a strong military. So that's how Abdallah Azzam and Bin Laden kind of relate ideologically. Kind of Abdallah Azzam came, he brought this sort of worldview of the Muslim nation under attack, and of the need to fight everywhere on their behalf. And then Bin Laden took it a step further, kind of on the tactical side.
So let me ask, two different men from two very different backgrounds. Bin Laden, as we know, is the son of a very wealthy constructor, developer, is himself wealthy and goes off to fight under different circumstances from Saudi Arabia. But Azam is initially Palestinian. Family leaves Israel-Palestine for Jordan, where he's educated. He has theological background. He has theological training, which Bin Laden never has. And his rationale for the defense of Muslims by Muslims has a firmer theological basis than what would come later in the action phase with Bin Laden. Was his, and through his life, he had religious roles, whether as a teacher or as a preacher. Was this really a critical distinction in terms of the two stages that you're talking about, that the initial argument on behalf of this kind of defense of Muslim communities would best be framed in theological terms, and that Azam was the person or a person who could do that?
Yeah, you touched on something very important there. So Abdallah Azzam had very strong theological credentials. He had a PhD in Islamic law from the University of Al-Azhar in Cairo, which in this period was, the leading seat of learning for Islamic law in the world. And so he had a lot of authority. When he spoke, people listened. And this clerical background, this sort of solid training, I think explains both his influence, why he was relatively influential, despite the fact that some of his ideas were quite radical. And they also explain his restraint. So the fact that he did not advocate for what we might call sort of terrorist tactics of kind of carrying out operations outside theaters of war like Afghanistan. So his clerical credentials, together with his connections inside the Muslim Brotherhood, this Islamist organization, the leading Islamist organizations in the Middle East in this period, which provided this provided him with connections. So this clerical background and his connections help explain why he was so big, as it were, because he really was the most famous, militant Islamist ideologues in the world in the 1980s, and he was widely read. His magazine, Al-Jihad magazine, which he published from Pakistan, was circulated, in the tens of thousands of copies every month, and his books widely read. We don't know exactly how many copies because nobody kept track of numbers, but anyway, he was very widely read, which I think has to do with his kind of credentials. But being well trained in Islamic law, he was also very well aware of the laws of war in the Islamic legal tradition, and probably, partly for that reason, was reluctant to kind of go down a more, unconventional warfare route. And this is significant, because, of course, from the 90s onwards, we see a steady kind of brutalization of the tactics used by militant Islamists. You start seeing kind of beheadings, bombings against civilians, bombings outside of theaters of war, and then of course culminating with 9/11. And in recent years, of course, we've seen Islamic State with all their horrific execution methods and so on. This represents a sort of sort of brutalization and kind of I don't know what the word is, but a kind of process of sort of almost like debasing a little bit of the kind of the original cause, which I'm sure Azzam would have been skeptical towards. But this brutalization has happened and has been led entirely by people without serious training in Islamic law. Azzam was one of the very last people with PhDs in Islamic law to be involved with this movement. For the most part, they've all been lay people.
It's interesting because one of the points you make in the book in describing his appeal for Arabs to come to Afghanistan and fight, one of the points you make is that he was able to make this appeal because even though he was theologically trained and had theological credentials, he was acting sort of in a context where the standards of authority were already breaking down. And so it wasn't just dependent on a local cleric. Someone could respond from one of the Arab countries to the call to come from Afghanistan, to come to Afghanistan from a cleric in Afghanistan, even though their governments or their families would have been telling them not to do that. So Azzam finding this cause justifies the jihad that he's urging is nonetheless, to some degree, contributing to the kind of structural breakdown that, of course, then accelerates and becomes, even more pronounced in the next generation of fighters who really, to a very large degree, have almost no connection to, sort of standard theological interpretations and practices.
Exactly. Yeah, that's also a very central point that I make in the book, that that this is partly a story of breakdown in authority, and Abdallah Azzam kind of he helped speed up that breakdown. I mean, he himself was a manifestation of an erosion of authority, in the sense that when he said that kind of all Muslims have to travel to Afghanistan to fight, regardless of what their parents say or what their local imams might say or any other people might say, this was a minority position, and there were most clerics around the Muslim world would say, yeah, we agree that there is a jihad going on in Afghanistan. We agree that the fight of the Afghan people is legitimate and that it has, it is sacred. However, we do not think it's right for young Muslims everywhere to travel. So that was the majority position. But Azzam, being kind of, enthused with this sort of pan-Islamist kind of worldview or sentiment, if you will, figured that the well-being of the ummah, of the Muslim nation, was more important. That what could be more important than that? So it's such a crisis that we have to disregard all these other concerns. People have to drop what they have in their hands and go and fight. So this this in a sense was a minority position. So he was departing a little bit from the mainstream. Although, so already there, he's contributing to the kind of this erosion of authority. But the real kind of problem that he created was a little bit later, when he started sort of almost codifying in his writings an argument for why people should drop everything in their hands and go and fight. Because what he essentially did was, in doing so, was say that don't listen to authority. If somebody says you shouldn't go, don't listen to them. And the thing is that by doing that, he's opening a Pandora's box. Because once you've told someone not to listen to authority, at some point they're going to stop listening to you as well. They're going to become uncontrollable because it's been imprinted in them that all kind of traditional forms of authority are just corrupt and not worth listening to. And I think it's no coincidence that it's after Azzam introduced this argument that the jihadi movement has kind of devolved into kind of ever more brutality, ever more factionalization, and so on. It's because it's leaderless. They cannot agree on anything, and they've long since stopped listening to kind of mainstream Islamic clerics. And so this is a story of kind of a collapse in authority, and that and Azzam played an important role in it.
Maybe we'll get to this a little bit later, but you talk about a collapse in authority or people's confidence in authority as it pertains to this radical movement. I mean, we are seeing this in relation to other radical movements, including the domestic issues here in the United States. You've experienced it in Norway. I want to come back to that at the end of the talk, but let's stick with Azzam for a moment anyway. What brings him to Afghanistan? Take us to the point of his arrival. What motivated him to go there? And what did he do when he got there? And why did he have the authority, again, however long it lasted, why did he have the authority to do what he was doing there?
So Azzam ended up in Afghanistan, I think, largely because he was a vagabond. He had been made rootless in 1967, when the so-called Six-Day War brought Israeli occupation of the West Bank, where he lived, and he decided he did not want to live under Israeli authority, and decided to emigrate, to flee to Jordan. And he was never able to go back to Palestine, and he was for the rest of his life on the move. So in the first few years after leaving Palestine in 1967, he spent a year in Saudi Arabia. He spent a while in Jordan. Then he went to Egypt to study for his PhD. Then he came back to Jordan again. And then things stabilized a bit for him in Jordan. But towards the end of the 1970s, he became something of a political pariah, because he was a vocal critic of many governments, including the Jordanian government, and he spoke openly about politics, which was sensitive. And around 1980, the Jordanian government sort of has enough and so basically fires him from his job at the university, and kind of pressures him to leave Jordan. Of course, this is only possible it's only possible to evict him because he's already an immigrant. He's already a Palestinian in Jordan. So the fact that he was already kind of on the move made him more vulnerable in Jordan. And so he's evicted from there in 1980, and he moves to Saudi Arabia, where he interacts with Osama bin Laden. They probably met a little bit before, but it's in Saudi that they get to know each other more. But Azzam doesn't like it very much in Saudi. In this period, his family hates it there, and then in 1981, he gets an opportunity to move to Pakistan and take up a teaching position at a university there. And he decides to go, in large part because he was interested in getting closer to the war in Afghanistan. Azzam was a sort of a news junkie and was, very interested in, kind of the international politics of the Muslim world. And so he had been following the Russian invasion of Afghanistan closely from late '79 onward. So he jumped to the chance of moving there and kind of getting involved in some way. But I think the broader point here is that Azzam was kind of disposed to moving there because he was uprooted already. He had little to lose. Had he been sort of living in kind of his home country with a PhD from Al-Azhar, he would have had a very a great job, good salary, etc. Would have had a lot of incentives not to break up and join a war, which is why I think so few clerics ended up doing what he did. So his ruthlessness, I think, is crucial here. But I want to add.
Go ahead. No, go ahead. Finish. Yeah.
I just want to add one more point, which is important to understand why he goes there at this time, which is that from the late '70s onwards, you have a separate development taking place in the Middle East and particularly in Saudi Arabia, which is the rise of kind of what I call pan-Islamist activists. And these are not militants. These are people who work typically in NGOs and charities and so on. But they're part of a kind of a growing kind of international network of activists and proselytizers and so on. And all of them are kind of, they all kind of embrace this worldview that the Muslim world is under attack and that Muslims have to help each other. It's just that they haven't quite reached the point, where Azzam would later reach of, that they have to fight militarily, but they're involved in kind of, providing aid and other things to Muslims around the world. And so, and it's these networks, with these networks come job opportunities like the one that Azzam had in Pakistan, and job opportunities in sort of in NGOs, etc., in other war zones. So Azzam's sort of arrival or joining the Afghan jihad was kind of overdetermined. There were lots of things kind of going on at this time that were kind of pushing in this direction. In fact, so much so that I wonder if if there hadn't been a jihad in Afghanistan, if the Russians hadn't invaded, I think Azzam might very well have ended up somewhere else in some other war, in relatively similar circumstances.
He does find himself in these circumstances, which, as you describe them, are really intended in some way or are fundamentally sympathetic with the idea that there is this new global movement brewing among Muslims, and that whether it's the NGOs or the university settings that he's in, there is an idea that many people hold that there is a fight worth fighting in the case of those in Pakistan right across the border in Afghanistan. Now, he's not rooted in Pakistani society, so he may not be the source of support from within Pakistani society for the Afghan jihad, but it turns out he is a link back to Arabs who take up this cause. How is it that he begins organizing the support of Arabs coming initially, of course, to Pakistan, to take up arms in the jihad.
Yeah. So the important thing to know here is that it was largely through the kind of the hard work of Azzam and his companions that people came. After, later on and after the war, there was a narrative, especially in the Muslim world, about how the Muslim world as a whole had kind of spontaneously come to the rescue immediately to the beleaguered Afghan people, right after the Russians invaded and so on. That's only partly true, and it's not true of kind of foreign fighting. The people didn't start going as volunteers in substantial numbers until the late 1980s, actually. So it took sort of 6, 7, 8 years for this sort of Afghan Arab phenomenon to emerge, which suggests that it wasn't a spontaneous kind of popular reaction to the Russian invasion. It was something else, and I think that something else is largely kind of hard organizational building work by Azzam and others in this time. And it involves all the classical tools and techniques of organization building in almost any other context, which is organize yourself so that you have kind of functional differentiation of tasks, and you can coordinate things and become more efficient. Make sure you have a flow of funds because you need to pay for things. Spread the word. Produce pamphlets and books and magazines so that people know that you are there and can join you. All these things Azzam did. And I guess the most sort of famous sort of part of this was this so-called Services Bureau, this organization that Azzam set up in 1984 together with Osama bin Laden.
So tell me about their relationship at this point, because I'm sorry to cut you off, but the Services Bureau is sort of facilitating the movement of Arab fighters or Arab men who want to come and become fighters. Now, they're not necessarily well situated in Pakistan. They may arrive with really no idea of what happens next, or how to get to the fighting, or whether they're trained for fighting or not. So he and bin Laden and some others become sort of the central point of reference for anybody from the Arabic-speaking world who wants to come and take part in this. What are their services that they're offering at this point? And what is the channel by which they bring people from Pakistan into Afghanistan?
Yeah, so the Services Bureau is very important. And we know this because you can, if you draw a curve of the numbers of volunteers going to Afghanistan, it starts to, it shoots up only after the Services Bureau is created. And we know that many of the people who went also in the late 80s came through after having read magazines by the Services Bureau. So, and the Bureau was the kind of the first sort of formalization of this foreign fighter movement. So as I mentioned, 1984, late 1984 is when it is set up. Of course, in the previous years, you did have some volunteers showing up in Pakistan and Afghanistan wanting to fight, but they were in the low tens of people. And that's partly because there was no organization. They had nowhere to turn. Nowhere was there to help them. This was one of the motivations for Azzam himself, because he was there, as a teacher, and kind of, he played the role of a sort of a diplomat as well, mediating between the Afghan leaders. And he saw how some of these people were coming eager to fight, but there was no one to kind of no way to kind of harness their energy. also, Azam was getting really sick of the kind of the bickering between the Afghan leaders at this time. He spent 3 or 4 years mediating between them, and it got nowhere. They just kept quarreling. So he decided to sort of shift focus and set up this organization to help kind of incoming volunteers, get deployed. Now, it's important to know that they called it the Services Bureau, not because it was to provide services to the foreign fighters, but services to the Afghans. That was their idea. The idea was that volunteers would come from around the world, and the Services Bureau would make sure that these resources were allocated in an efficient way. By the way, here lies the kind of the seed of a kind of a split or a tension that we'll come back to, in that Azam, using the Services Bureau, Azam, allocated these resources to several different things, not just fighting. So he wanted these Arab Afghans to be useful to the Afghan resistance, and but that did not necessarily mean in terms of fighting. It could be in terms of distributing blankets in refugee camps, or transporting ammunition to the border, or sweeping the floor of an orphanage or something like that. So he had a kind of broad pragmatic view of warfare. That it's just not all about being on the front lines. And of course, this was to become a kind of a bone of contention between him and bin Laden.
Well, bin Laden is much more, if you speak about division of labor, bin Laden is much more focused on the fighting in Afghanistan, which is not necessarily well received by the various Afghan groups. The numbers of Arabs are very small, their training is minimal. And yet bin Laden wants these fighters to participate in the jihad. And it seems as if bin Laden's idea of what the point of all of this was, particularly in the years leading to the Soviet withdrawal and the victory of the Afghans, bin Laden's idea seems to have been creating a kind of elite fighting force that could be used in other circumstances as times required. Whereas Azam is focused on, as you described them, the immediate needs. Is that a fair characterization? And was that real friction and tension between them? Because as you write, it seems that there was never great hostility between the two of them. They just kind of drifted in other directions. And bin Laden's work would ultimately take him to the creation of Al-Qaeda.
Yeah, that's largely true. And but I would sort of add that the kind of the difference between them, which kind of grew a little bit bigger in the late 80s, it was not so much about ideology as about kind of ways of working, if you will, something more kind of proximate, more micro in a sense. And I mentioned how the Services Bureau wanted the volunteers to do all kinds of work. Now, that problem with that was that a lot of the people who came were not interested in sweeping floors of orphanages. They wanted to fight on the front lines. They wanted to be little Rambos. They wanted to be heroes on the front line, to see real action. And it's probably an age factor here too. Azam was by this time in his 40s, and many of the people who came were much younger. So you have these 18 to 22-year-old testosterone-filled young men, coming to a war zone. They're not coming to sweep floors. They're coming to fight, most of them. And so some of them found that the Services Bureau just didn't offer what they wanted, that it was just slow. It was for kind of, it's fine what they're doing, but they're not providing enough combat opportunities.
And that was where bin Laden would step in. It's interesting, in the more conventional tellings of the history of Al-Qaeda, the Services Bureau is described as sort of the origins of Al-Qaeda. And in some sense, bin Laden working through the Services Bureau is, of course, his initial steps into this. But as you write, al-Qaeda emerges really from a separate initiative by bin Laden, which Azzam knew about, didn't oppose, but wasn't particularly involved with. And that is the establishment of a base of operations for the training of these fighters. And so there's a divergence there that, again, doesn't seem in your telling to involve hostility. It just involves two very different approaches to solving the problem. Tell us about, because this now is, as you describe it, the actual origin of al-Qaeda. They create a training camp known as Al-Masada, but in shorthand becomes known as al-Qaeda, as the base, the translation of the term into English. So this is actually a point where there's a reference to a physical place and a very specific set of challenges that they are trying to solve as a new kind of organization.
That's right. So this is where sort of the story of al-Qaeda really begins, in my view. The Services Bureau kind of, it played a role in a sense, in bringing many people there and, creating a network of sorts. But it's entirely possible to kind of to think of a counterfactual historical scenario where you have the Services Bureau and no al-Qaeda, developing afterwards. It wasn't kind of predestined that you'd have an al-Qaeda because of the Services Bureau. What happens in this Al-Masada camp is different. Now, before I go into that, let me just mention briefly kind of how bin Laden got involved with this, because it's interesting that he kind of went from 0 to 100 over just like a year-long period. Because up until 1984, he was nowhere near the front line in Afghanistan. He would go occasionally to Pakistan to donate money to the cause, but he never left. He never came to Peshawar, the border town where Azam and many of the other volunteers were. In part because he was, he had been told by his family and others kind of not to get too close to trouble. It's fine to support the jihad, but you shouldn't get involved in the fighting. So he was kind of a reluctant, supporter of the Afghan jihad. And then in 1984, Azzam persuades him to go and have a look. Why don't you go up there in the border areas? It's very interesting. You should go and see. And he goes there, and he becomes kind of infatuated with this military business. And from then on, it's just, I want to fight. I want to be on the front lines for him. And so quickly he finds that the Services Bureau is not providing what he wants. And in 1986, he sets up this camp just inside on the Afghan side of the Pakistani-Afghan border, in a very exposed place. Many people said it was madness to set up base there because the chances of getting killed were so high. But I think this was part of the point. They wanted to do something really kind of crazy in a sense, to just sort of show their bravery. Because this was what I think it was very much about for bin Laden and kind of his comrades. It was just to prove themselves. In some sense, it was as basic as that. But the side effect was al-Qaeda, because when you set up a base like that, you have to run it in some way. You have to have someone to get water, someone to go into town every few days to get food. Someone have to empty the latrines, and you want to do some training, so you have to have a trainer, and you have to have a kind of a commander on top, and maybe somewhere in the middle. You have to have organization. And so my theory about kind of the origins of al-Qaeda is that it emerged from this camp, from the kind of the proto-bureaucracy that formed in this camp. And later, when in 1988, when you start seeing the contours of an al-Qaeda organization that refers to itself as such, it consists largely of people who were there in this base a year and a half earlier. So it emerged from this sort of this camp and from a community that saw itself as kind of the special forces of the Islamic world.
Let me jump right there because that's exactly where they are at the end of the Soviet-Afghan War. And as you write, the next couple of years are pretty quiet in the history of al-Qaeda, and the training continues. So the idea of this sort of elite fighting force is there. But then at some point in the mid-90s, they take on a much different profile in which bin Laden is making essentially foreign policy, challenging the Saudis and declaring war on the United States. How do you track the transformation of a much more modest initially approach of training fighters that would be used, of course, at some point, but then essentially bin Laden becoming this advocate for a global war? Or was one inherent in the other and just hadn't revealed itself yet at the early points of their operations?
Yeah, so this is a very difficult question, I think, because I think part of that story just takes place inside Osama bin Laden's mind, and individuals can develop ideas or worldviews for idiosyncratic reasons. Now, but having said that, one of the things I show in the book is that the Afghan Arabs in the 1980s were very, very anti-American and anti-Western in general. So, in some of the kind of simplified, narratives about the rise of jihadism, you get the sense that they had nothing against the West until 1990, when America became involved in the Gulf War and sent troops to Saudi and all that. So there's like this cutoff in 1990 in terms of relationship with the West, but that's not true at all. The Al-Jihad magazines and the writings of Azam and others in the 1980s are full of diatribes against the West and the US. So in some sense, this sort of some kind of offensive against the West may have been kind of almost inevitable. That some faction in this growing and increasingly unruly movement would try it on with America may have been kind of inevitable. Of course, there are other factors to remember too. One is the Gulf War and the deployment of U.S. troops to Saudi Arabia, which became a sort of a symbolic cause for many Islamists, and became kind of sort of it kind of brought America a little bit deeper into the Middle East and so on. But also that as bin Laden became more and more of a renegade. Over the years, kind of his relationship with the Saudi authorities, were fraying. He was spending more and more time with people like Ayman al-Zawahiri, who were involved in a vicious campaign of violence against the Egyptian regime. All these sorts of things probably contributed to more radical or kind of daring thinking. And at some point, he and the people around him sort of said, "Well, screw it. We're going to try and take on America." Nobody had done that before in the movement, so it was sort of a wild idea, and there was a lot of pushback. Some people were saying, you can't, that's just pointless. America is too powerful, or taking the war to America, that's not the main problem we have. We should fight others and so on. But anyway, that idea was new and it was daring, and it didn't really get a lot of traction in the community until after 9/11, actually. So the 9/11 attack in itself, of course, also helped by the actions in the war on terror, the invasion of Iraq, etc., gave this idea of war on the West a lot more kind of wind in the sails.
Let me ask, a couple more questions. We're running out of time. The story of Abdallah Azzam ends abruptly on November 24th, 1989, in Peshawar, where he's living with his family and working, preaching, where he is killed by sabotage, by a car bomb, or by a bomb blowing up under his car. Two of his sons are with him on the way to the mosque. We don't have time to go into the full detail of it, but nobody quite knows who is responsible for this. But he had by then alienated people on various sides. But your suspicions tend to lie more with the possibility that it was Pakistani intelligence or Afghan intelligence, because they would have been more organized and capable than perhaps some of his closer allies.
Yeah, so this remains a mystery. It's like it's probably the biggest murder mystery in the history of Islamism, and there, as you say, there are several candidates. I think I go through about 10 of them. And the problem is that there's no forensic evidence really to go by, and that Azam had lots of small enemies, moderately angry enemies, but no really big ones. So it's just a matter of kind of picking between this sort of medium-sized candidate to find out who looks more plausible. And I think it's an impossible task really without more information. So I talk about Pakistani and Afghan intelligence because I think there are aspects about the operation which are quite technically challenging, which would have been a lot easier for a government agency, especially one operating on home turf.
Let me just quote you. You said, "This bombing, the assassination of Azam, will stand as the jihadi equivalent of the JFK assassination, a mysterious loss of a dear figure that became a source of endless speculation." So leaving him for now, the question of the current threat and the nature of where this stands, do you see, and we have questions from our participants here in the program, do you see al-Qaeda now and the groups that have even gone further, do they still pose a threat to the far enemy, if you will, the US and the West? Are they still focused that way? And also, does the unrest in the United States, and we'll come to the domestic terror threat next, but does the unrest in the United States almost set the stage of vulnerability for further attacks? Is this something that jihadi groups who are thinking of hitting the United States might be looking at as providing an opportunity for?
So I think the one thing there's so much to say here, but one thing I will say is this, that very too often we think about terrorist threats as something that lives, that has a life of its own. There's sort of al-Qaeda out there, and it's strong or it's weak or it's angry against us or it's less angry, and depending on this, it will strike. But we forget that it's an interplay between our policies, our countermeasures, and their intentions and capabilities. So, in some sense, we can. So, regarding the likelihood of an attack, I would say the likelihood of an al-Qaeda attack in the U.S. Given the current sort of machinery of defense against al-Qaeda is very low, because there are so many mechanisms in place to stop it through years and years and lots of expenditure in the war against al-Qaeda. But let's assume that we were to lift this. So let's assume we conclude, there's no threat at all. We've overinvested. Let's take away all of this. Then, of course, the US will be a much easier target to strike, and you're probably likely to see some attacks, because the intention is certainly there in parts of this movement. So, but of course, in some sense, with counterterrorism, you get sort of marginal returns. So there's always going to be a small marginal threat, and to get rid of that last little bit is very expensive. Yeah. So it's a political question, really. How much do you want to spend to get it to zero?
Let me ask, and we came across this before, and I think it's a good place to close, because we at the museum will be doing further programming on the issue of domestic terror threats. But you in Norway have suffered a terrible attack in relation to your population, more losses on July 22nd, 2011 than we in the United States suffered on 9/11. And that was the July 22nd attack, where 77 Norwegians were killed, most of them teenagers, by a domestic terrorist. You have spent your career studying the foreign forms of terrorism, if you will, but now we've seen what we've seen in the United States, and so this movement has traction not just in your country, but here and other places. Do you see similarities? Do you see similar categories of analysis, similar ways that these movements take root, similar ways in which they could be contested? It's a very different fight when it's a domestic fight, of course, than it is with a force overseas. But what are the similarities and differences you see among these sort of domestic white supremacist kinds of ideologies and movements and the Islamist, jihadi, al-Qaeda type of movement?
Yeah, so this is another big question. We'll go over time, I think, if I give a full answer to it. But there are lots of similarities, but also lots of differences. On the similarity side, you have on both sides a kind of a sense of siege. First of all, a sense of like an in-group, a community, that is us, and then this us is threatened from the outside by hostile enemies, and this threat is considered so serious as to justify extreme countermeasures, extreme measures. I think both sides, as in fact do almost all terrorist groups, they see this as defense, as they see the use of violence as justified because the other side, the enemy, is doing worse things. You also have ideas of conspiracies, because in order to get to this worldview where you see yourself as being under such a threat, you have to have a slightly different view of how the world works sometimes, and so you have conspiratorial thinking on both sides. So but there are also differences, and I at this particular time, I think there's so much talk about the similarities. And how this is kind of just two sides of the same coins, and to some extent it is. But I think, if we do that, we also miss some important aspect of it. So one difference, for example, is afterlife beliefs. So this idea that the idea that dying in combat is actually very beneficial because you're rewarded strongly in the afterlife. This is more widespread on the jihadi side than on the extreme right side. It's not like it doesn't exist. Such ideas don't exist on the right wing side, but it's just more prevalent on the jihadi side. So, and this can lead, I think, to tactical differences, like more suicide operations on the jihadi side, and so on. So. But I want to kind of end on a kind of a positive note, in a sense, which is that our kind of states are stronger in the end, and that none of these organizations is realistically able to kind of seriously undermine our societies and public order. We forget sometimes how powerful our states have become, and that we forget also that technology has tended to basically to make states stronger. It benefits states more than non-state actors. Think of the possibilities of surveillance and all this today, and if we have some violence and some radical activism going on, it's in part because we let them. It's because we've decided politically not to use all of these surveillance powers. And this is to say that what often happens is that, when things come a little bit out of hand, when the violence increases, when you have let's say a dramatic increase in violence, like you had in Europe during the ISIS period, in 2015, 2016, well, what happens? Well, the states take their gloves off. They get a mandate from the population, and they just use some of these really strong powers to hunt down the networks and the movement, and usually with quite a bit of success. And this, I think, is what might happen should there be a serious escalation in far right violence in the US. The FBI and the rest of the law enforcement community will take their gloves off, and they will use more of the many tools that they have at their disposal, and will kind of overcome the threat. So this is not a sort of an existential or a very serious violence threat, but it is primarily something that can sometimes erupt in sort of attacks here and there, and some of them, of course, can be very, very lethal. You had the Oklahoma City bombing in '95, and you had the Oslo attack in 2011, and individual incidents like that can happen. But I'm not that worried about sort of a major wave of pain of violence, neither from the far right nor from the jihadis.
It's fascinating, and I appreciate you taking that little detour at the end here. There is so much more to say, and then the book is really, really fascinating. I want to show it again. The Caravan, Abdallah Azzam, and the Rise of Global Jihad, really getting into much more of the detail of what we discussed today. And as I mentioned earlier, we will be coming back in our museum programming to this question of domestic terror threats as well. Let me close by asking those of you who are coming new to our programs to consider whether or not you would like to support these programs by becoming members of the museum. This is a great way to provide a sign of support in these difficult times, difficult for many organizations, but for ours as well. So if this is the kind of programming that you'd like, please consider supporting the museum. And with that, let me thank our friend Thomas Hegghammer. It's not the first time that Thomas has been with us for programs. I suspect it will not be the last time. So consider that a veiled threat, Thomas. We'll be back to you. But thank you so much for taking the time. And let me close by saying, on behalf of the museum, I'm Clifford Shannon. Have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.